being are interested in, with a great affection for, and I'd like to welcome Lord Barnard to give his talk on a landowner's perspective. So far, we've had the AONB, we've had Natural England, Game Conservancy, and Wildlife Trust, Teesdale. Last week we had John Bell, was a farmer in the Dale. Now I welcome Lord Barnard to give us his perspective.
Thank you, Margaret, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me here this evening, if only by Zoom. What I'm going to really do is just a bit of an overview. Probably not really getting into a huge amount of detail. And I'd just like to say I'm not in terms of presentations. This is actually the first Zoom presentation I've done. So one thing I've just discovered is the lights in the evening don't work terribly well in my office. So it sort of seems to come and go a bit in terms of visibility. But there we are. Just also give my thanks generally to the group for all the good work you do in Upper Teesdale. I thought I'd better get that in, Margaret, otherwise I'll be told off. But it's great that there is so much interest in the amazing flora in Teesdale. I was hoping to, with the Zoom, to sort of hide myself at one point when I'm going through the slideshow, because there's a little bit of there's one section where I was really reading something out, but unfortunately I don't want to do that, just in case I can't get back on. So give me on those bits if it's just something that it looks like I'm reading. To start, really, as a landowner, well, am I representing other landowners in this talk? No, not particularly. It's sort of a personal view, really. And as Margaret said, obviously Raby is a big landowner in the Upper Dale. But having said that, within Upper Teesdale, it's certainly there's a lot of other farmers, estates, and so on. And I just thought it'd be worth having a look at this map of the area. Can I ask, can everyone see that that's sharing all right, is it? Good, thanks, Tricia. Yes. So obviously north of the river there's the Raby estate, but not entirely to the north. There's the likes of Eggleston Moor and generally the land around Eggleston that's nothing to do with Raby. The south there's the Strathmore estate. To the west you've got you're off the estate there, and a place like Birkdale, and obviously in the south there's Loondale, Baldersdale, farmers around Mickleton, Rommelkirk area, and the moors, the Cudderston and Lartington Moor and so on, in the uplands there, and then there's the whole Bowes area as well. I was just going to show a handful of photos, really just for the sake of it, of areas off the estate. This is Baldersdale, just near Hannah's Meadow, and that's pretty much the picture on the left is pretty much an image of looking from the other way of Hannah's Meadow at the actual farmhouse there. The one in the centre, I'm afraid I couldn't resist it. It is Harwood Beck, and it is of Raby. On the right, you've got Newbegin and parts of the Strathmore estate across the river. So Margaret sort of asked the question, which I think all the other speakers touched on, and it's really just a reference point of who determines the view. I'd just like to say the first thing about all the views is that obviously it's a very managed landscape and has been for a very long time. People often think it's a wild landscape, but I'm sure nobody listening to this this evening will think that. And when we're talking about who determines the view, I suppose we're mainly thinking of habitat and changes in habitat and who brings those about. And I was thinking what's sort of a bit unique about landowners' interests, if you like, whether they be farmers or larger landowners with farm tenancies and so on. And I guess one of the things compared to some of the other speakers is it has to be economically viable. As such, whilst we're not totally making our own income always, because there can be an element of taxpayers' money through support for certain things like higher level stewardship and countryside stewardship agreements, which would largely directly go to the farm tenants, but a small amount will, if it's above the fell line, might end up with the estate. But on the whole, we have to be self-sustaining and be able to reinvest in the estate, and that's obviously true of all landowners. The other thing that I felt was perhaps a little different from some of the other groups is accountability, because as they're private and family estates, they've often been something that's been in the family for many generations, and if we do something really stupid, we can't just disappear very easily. So we are sort of accountable in a way that perhaps those who work for organizations often move on to other places, and there's a new person in and that's it, really. But having said that, actually with most of the organizations in Upper Teesdale, it does seem that those who either run or work on them have been with them for a very long time. I was just thinking, I was hearing about Chris Woodley Stewart, also Martin Furness with Natural England and the Game Conservancy, Phil Warren and so on. They've all been in the Upper Dale, but for actually a very long time. But I think that's actually probably quite unusual with these organizations. I should also obviously mention, in terms of the different interests, I mean, the farmers are the ones actually on the ground day in, day out, and will have that intimate knowledge that certainly a landowner with tenant farms won't have quite to that same extent. I just think out of all the organizations that we've heard about, it really is the farmer who is the one on the ground with in many ways the best knowledge of what's there. Just going back to the multi-purpose land use thing again, it's obvious, but a particular area of land can have all sorts of functions going on with it, and I think we'll look at that later. So whether it's farming, shooting, the nature, carbon, water, so I hope to look at that a bit more later. Finally, we've got a point on restrictions. Many may think that landowners and farmers can pretty much do what they want. That was true probably in the 19th century, but it certainly isn't true now. As a rule, I feel that the further you go up the hill, the more restrictions there seem to be. In Upper Teesdale, obviously, there's a number of statutory designations, such as the SACs, the Special Areas of Conservation, the SSSIs, ANOBs. There's Durham County Council with planning, and Natural England. Almost anything you do, and this applies to all farmers, comes with various do's and don'ts and requires consent. An example of this is if you want to put up a fence upon a fell or common, you need consent from the Secretary of State. I think, though, owners do still have an ability to be quite proactive about things, perhaps in a way that these other organisations can't in quite the same way, because we don't have to ask for the landowner's permission. Just moving on. Yes, I thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of background to Raby itself. I mentioned some of the other land holdings in Upper Teesdale, but I think what makes Raby unique is that it sort of contains all sorts of habitats. Others you may get farms, or you may get grouse moors or moors, but Raby contains the sort of valley ground in byland as well, and the moorland as well. So in that respect, I feel it is a little bit unique. So just a little bit on the past of Raby. There's probably some very good local historians. I know there are up the Dale, so I don't want to go on about it too much, mainly because I'll get it wrong. But early on, I think it was a remote and wild area. The forest of Teesdale obviously relates to the sort of forest laws, and it's not necessarily about trees, but it's more about deer and hunting and so on. And I've certainly read in some books that there was quite a sort of venison trade going on up the Dale early on. The other thing there was there was quite a connection with the church, and one or two place names relate to that. For example, there's Dirt Pit. There's a chapel at Dirt Pit Farm in Ettersgill, and you've got places like Monk's Moor and so on. And I believe I'm right in saying that Dirt Pit, for example, was part of Revo Abbey. Then, of course, came the lead mining, which was a major impact in the Upper Dale. Obviously, everyone's very aware of that. Some areas of the North Pennines, or some landowners, dealt with this differently from others. I think up in further north, in the North Pennines, the landowners may have been directly involved, but in Middleton to Teesdale and Upper Teesdale, it was all let out to the London Lead Company, and they were the major influences on the area. This picture is one of Greenhearth, and I can't say exactly what date it was.
Sorry, I shouldn't have spoken. I just said it was massive.
Yes, it really is. There's a lot of very large features, really, when you go back. But I think
this one, not far out. In fact, say for other people, they'd have heard of Cow Green mine. If you go up the Tees, you had dummy site mine. And then further up still, almost at the county boundary, was Green Hearth Mine.
That's very helpful. Yeah, thank you for that.
Sorry
I think one of the... No, you haven't at all. I think
stride.
one of the features of lead mining was something like 9/10 of the employment up the Dale was related to lead mining at its peak. And we're really talking about, I guess, the 18th century is really when it started having a bit of traction, and primarily the 19th. Foreign competition undercutting, I think, starting about 1840s, and then again later, led to its demise. What I'll move on to now is a picture. This is the 4th Duke of Cleveland, who was he was also Lord Barnard, but he also had the title of a duke, and he was sort of Lord of Raby from the 1860s to 1890, but he did quite a lot up in the Dale. And in fact, last year I came across his wife's sort of diaries, and she's just done a little mention on Upper Teesdale in it, and this is the bit I was going to read, because he actually did a lot of development in the Upper Dale. Some of it, there might be a tiny bit of artistic license on some of it, but she's written in 1887 that he was responsible for a great transformation of Teesdale and found a wild upland valley in the poorest condition. I'm not quite sure if that was absolutely true, but anyway, she goes on to say there was a narrow strip of rich grass by the riverside, all the rest was marsh and moor. And about the middle of the last century, Arthur Young, by the last century, she's talking about the 19th century, 18th century, Arthur Young writes that Lord Darlington commenced enclosing some part of the moor near Newbegin, and the work was partially continued by his successors, but it was for the Duke to make Upper Teesdale what it is now. She goes on to say that excellent schools are distributed throughout the valley. Churches and chapels are also provided, and the church at Forest was built by the Duke's elder brother. Going on to the land itself, it goes on to say that the first and most pressing necessity was drainage, which had been entirely neglected, for even in the enclosures that had already been made into pastures, they were very wet and unhealthy, devoid of nutritious grasses, and full of carnation grasses and other wiry, watery weeds. I'm afraid those are probably all the flowers we love, but anyway, that's what it says. The drains, which proved costly owing to the large quantity of stone to be removed, were dug 4 feet deep and 7 yards wide and laid with pipes. The Duke had a large gang of men constantly employed, except in the hay season, which is the Dale's main harvest, and spent £24,800 on drainage alone, which is about 3 million. It's calculated that the old pastures, thus treated, support more than 3 times the former amount of stock, and that of a very superior quality. A very considerable area of new land was additionally reclaimed, some of it being 2,000 feet above sea level. The stones thrown out were used for fencing and building walls, which was the next work to be undertaken. And this, together with road making, involved a further outlay of £15,000. There's then a bit about plantations, and finally on the housing, where new cottages were built and contained, as a rule, 5 rooms, the bedroom with fireplace and sash windows, easily opened. The ground floor rooms, all boarded except the kitchen, which is furnished with a baking and cooking range and boiler. Then there's a large dairy and shippen for the court and hay barns rendered necessary by the climate. The Duke apportioned one of these cottages to each 100 acres of grass or 50 acres of tillage. They go with the farms. Each has a garden with an allotment if required. They cost £25,000, which actually, even converted to modern day money, seems actually extremely good value by building costs now. These dalesmen in former times depended almost entirely on their earnings as miners, working the Teesdale lead. But now that foreign competition has pretty nearly extinguished the industry, their position has become untenable, or would have, without perhaps these farm investment in the farming side of things. And it goes on to say they're true maintainers, permanently attached to the soil, and counting emigration as the worst of all possible evils. So I thought that was perhaps of some interest. Just moving on to a bit more recently. So that's some old pictures of farming up the dale. And the recent past, really. There's an example of Unthank below, which was a building that's been derelict for really quite a long time. I just wanted really to have a very quick word really about my father's tenure, if you like. He really put a huge value and store on farm tenants and the farm tenancies up the dale and the communities there. And that was actually his top priority. The sales didn't really like selling very much, possibly helping. And I think because of that and generally the limited resources for reinvestment, some of the cottages have went downhill inevitably. Building costs seem to be pretty much the same wherever you are, but obviously rents, I'm not just talking farm rents, I'm thinking of cottage rents and so on, in a relatively remote location, are not going to be what they might be in more accessible locations. So now I'm just coming to the present and what we're doing in general terms. So I was really looking at different aspects. I think the farming side is really the backbone of the Dale and the community, the strongest community really. And in that respect, I very much agree with my father. But I will say that we also need to supplement it with some of the other possible income streams that may be available. And I think in that way, the Duke of Cleveland was very forward-thinking in looking at, say, the farming when actually lead mining wasn't doing too badly. So I think it's important to try to look ahead of what's actually happening at the time. So I'll just go to our sort of plans generally at Raby. This is just more a vision type thing, but which can come across as a very sort of generic, somewhat platitudinous thing. But in fact, we have given quite a lot of thought to the things that we feel are important. So you've got the core estate, looking after that, the family ownership and the hope to continue that, sustainability, which actually has a financial element, because it's also about reinvesting community and then natural environment, which I feel is very important, and sort of amenity and enjoyment. I think if there's no enjoyment at all, it becomes rather meaningless. So I'm not going to really say a huge amount about farming. I mean, apart from the fact that it is obviously extremely important. We don't farm directly anywhere. The estate doesn't anywhere in the Upper Dale. So we're talking about all let farms, all tenanted farms. The policy on these, interestingly, with reletting on the whole, I don't want to sort of say something then I'm going to have to totally and not have a tiny bit of flexibility about in the future. But generally, we are trying to re-let farms rather than sort of massive amalgamations when they come up and when the tenant farmer retires. Interestingly enough, there's actually quite a big demand, not just within immediately the Dale, but just outside. And actually, there's quite a demand from young families as well, which is reassuring. I think in some cases where the farm unit is very small, the prospective farm tenants are very open to the idea of other incomes, and actually, in a way, that's always been a feature of Upper Teesdale. With it might be various part-time jobs, or it may even be the partner or working and bringing in an income elsewhere, but that is very much part of the mix, I would say. But I put restrictions here because I was thinking about some of the constraints that tenant farmers are under. I think John Bell probably touched on these in his talk. There are obviously quite a lot of restrictions imposed by Natural England, but it could be argued that payments are also made. But I can see in some instances it can be frustrating. I actually think overall Natural England, you only have to look at the wildlife in the Upper Dale, which simply doesn't seem to exist in a lot of places elsewhere. I mean, it might up to an extent in the North Pennines, but you go outside that and it's really hard to find those numbers of waders or anything like that. And in some ways, I would say it's been a success what we're doing, but there has been perhaps an element with Natural England of where there's one size fits all. I'm not knocking people on the ground. It's just the way it's worked. And I know one of the issues has been the rushes and the rush encroachment, which I think, whether it be for nature or for farming, is really not a positive thing. I mean, the other restriction that John Bell touched on was to do with stocking and grazing, overgrazing, undergrazing, and I know there's differences of opinion, and perhaps what works for a grouse moor doesn't work quite so well for, you know, there's a lot of, but there's a lot of things in common as well. But I think it's difficult to know exactly what the right level is. It's interesting hearing about Widdy Bank and that area, where obviously from the nature point of view, quite a heavy grazing is quite positive to give the light to the alpine flowers. In other areas, it may be slightly different, but I'm not going to say what the answer is. I just thought I'd raise that. There's a lot of changes coming along the track, and I thought it was just worth mentioning UTAS, Upper Teesdale Agricultural Support, and the good job that they do. And actually, it's pretty unusual. I don't think it's replicated anywhere in the country as far as I'm aware. But in terms of what's going on, especially with the new agricultural transitions that's coming in, it's quite complicated, and I think all the help that UTAS can give will be greatly received, really. I thought I would have a word about grouse as well. I mean, obviously, it is a native bird, and in fact, I think I'm right in saying it's actually the only one all year round, whether it's the red or black grouse. Obviously, the waders are around, but they're only there during the sort of breeding season. So it is quite an iconic bird. On the subject of shooting, obviously people have different views on that. And I don't want to get into that territory really, but I would just perhaps say a few words about the shoot history really on Raby. We've got some records going back to the 1780s where people would, in fact, Lord Darlington would go to the top of the Dale for a few days. I think it was Grass Hills he sort of bunked down in, and shoot some grouse. Of course, in those days, it was not driven. It was with pointers, and it was walking up, if you like. The sort of driven grouse came in more around the mid-19th century. I will say, for some people, not those listening, I'm sure, but the thought is, you hear, oh, it's a reared bird and things like that. Obviously, it isn't. It's completely wild in that respect, and in a way, the shooting is a surplus. But you know, you can argue over the intensity or not. But what it does do is there are some wider benefits, whatever one may think of the shooting side of it, and those benefits really community employment. It does employ quite a lot of people, seasonal in terms of pickers up, also the hotel trade, beaters, and so on, and it employs people, keepers within the community who are there the whole time. It also brings actually money into areas that in many ways are not blessed with many potential forms of income. And in our own case, for example, we've you know, several houses have been totally renovated on the back of it. And of course, there's no taxpayers' money involved in any way. But I think perhaps one of the greatest benefits is to wildlife in general, because the keeping of generalist predators does allow, in particular, the waders to thrive. I'm just going to show the picture of 3 areas of heather. The first, actually, on the left is in the Lake District, where there is actually quite a lot of healthy heather, but there are no growths because there aren't any keepers. And actually, it's pretty much a desert as far as bird life is concerned generally. I mean, you can go there and walk there and see very, very little, and it's just amazing what you find in the North Pennines, and particularly in Teesdale. The second is some just healthy heather in Upper Teesdale, and the third picture is heather damaged by heather beetle, which has been a massive concern in the last couple of years. Actually, last season, as a result, largely through heather beetle and partially through weather, where there was absolutely no shooting whatsoever on Raby Estate. And on the year before, it was massively curtailed. I'm just going to move on to another land use, if you like, nature. It's probably fairly self-evident, a curlew and a black grouse and some flower meadows. I don't need to say to anyone listening that obviously it's a stronghold for nature, natural capital, whatever you may call it, the Upper Dale. I managed to get Charlie Burrell from NEP up, and he just could not believe. It was in, I think, end of April-ish, and all the waders were there, and he just couldn't believe the wildlife he saw. And the point I really want to make is that somehow in Upper Teesdale we seem to be able to combine farming with nature. And you hear so much about, you know, nature has to be a wilderness. And I think if it's managed well and compromises are made, that the two can coexist extremely well. The other point I'd just like to make about on this topic is the work of the GWCT, who have done an awful lot of surveys, not only on grouse, but on waders and so on. And this is invaluable information to compare and see what's happening. And although there has been a decline, it's nothing like what has happened elsewhere. So I'm probably getting a bit slow. I've still got a bit to go, but we're getting there. Leisure and tourism. This was before the health and safety police, clearly. I think it has been another string to the bow for Upper Teesdale. It's something obviously Raby's been looking at. We've done a lot of work at High Forks Hotel, and thinking of perhaps doing a bit more there as well. We've had Langdon Beck, we're doing a modest refurbishment shortly. Actually, it should be underway now, but the aim is to still retain it as a sort of very much a sort of walkers and community place. What has become apparent, though, is that Upper Teesdale is a very fragile environment, and you know, we've got to be really careful about tourism, leisure. It just has to be well managed, and I think management is the key. I know at the beginning of, well, at the end of the lockdown, the first lockdown, when there was no restrictions on, there was restrictions on things like pubs and so on, but none on traveling. There was the inundation with some very, very negative effects that we all know about, which must have made all those living in the Upper Teesdale an absolute nightmare. For High Force, it was quite a difficult one because people were actually, to begin with, we were closed, but people were breaking in and climbing over the gates and things, and a lot of sort of rowdy behaviour and bad behaviour, drink, everything. And so we took the view that it was better being managed, actually. So that's what happened. And the picture on the right obviously shows a couple of members of the staff protected, and we tried to manage it in a responsible way. I took the picture of the people in the middle. They were just having a barbecue at low force. I didn't dare tell them off, actually, Margaret, you probably would have. But anyway, we as a result of all this, we got a ranger, Andy Gibson, who's been incredibly helpful, and I think has helped out a lot with this and just general help with tourism and leisure. More moving on to carbon, this is a sort of thing that's obviously of the moment now. As a matter of interest, we had Raby did a sort of high-level carbon audit. It was quite interesting to see what the villains, or who the villains were. I thought it might be something like the grain dryers that use an awful lot of fuel and electricity, or indeed combines, which also use a lot of fuel. But actually, the two things that really stood out were peat and fertilizer. And the peat, it's just, if it's in poor condition, it really does result in an awful lot of carbon being lost. Funnily enough, in good condition, it sequestrates relatively slowly, but it's just a massive loss for poor condition peat, where it's exposed, where it's running off. And of course, there's the additional issues of sort of getting it into the water, and the colouring and so on from that.
No, Barnard,
Yes.
may I ask what these big sacks are full of?
Those sacks are all, those were brought in, that's all part of the peat restoration. It's sort of brash, which were brought in, which is then put down to help retain the water and not let it flow out. Right. So there's been a lot of work on peat restoration with the ANOB and so on, and that is continuing, and I think we're really making inroads on that.
I wasn't sure if this was cut peat being taken away from some area, not Teesdale, but somewhere else.
No, don't worry. It's not destined for a garden centre.
No, I understand.
Yeah, but I should have explained it. I should also mention. I just thought I'd also mention CSX. Of course, Raby have been doing a bit of work for a sort of start-off company, which is the director of which is Ed Milbank at Barningham Estates. And he's really particularly looking into measurements of carbon, both peat and trees as well. But it's sort of in its infancy, but actually measurement is so vital. You can't manage unless you measure. And in fact, there's been less measurement despite all this talk. We're still really only in the infancy of this, and especially when it comes to soil. I'll just give an example of some of the work he's doing on trees. This is kind of using drone data and other measurements which can identify actually single trees and work out from that, measure all the carbon and everything with this. And you find actually, you know, what you can do it through satellite and drone so much more cheaply in the long run than, you know, if you're going to have people on the ground, because the areas required are vast. And of course, with peat, they're looking into LiDAR and so on, with the radar, doing the same kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of work going on in that area at the moment. I should also mention with carbon, we're also with soils, we're testing soils. And interestingly enough, obviously the organic matter in soils is extremely important, and it can sequester an awful lot of carbon. We found with our sort of intensively farmed land, certainly a few years ago, some of it was it's about 1.5 to 2% organic matter. And organic matter is largely carbon, when really it should be 4 or 5%. And through sort of regenerative farming and direct drilling and putting in cover crops and so on, it should be quite easy to raise that carbon and actually sequester an awful lot of carbon within the soil. Interestingly enough, where there's permanent pasture, and we've done a few tests, and I have to say these soil tests are not infallible. It's kind of in its infancy, the measurements. There's so many different measurements, but there's some permanent pasture up the dale. You know, you can get as high as about 9% organic matter, which is massive. And I think this shows the point that, you know, that livestock is often demonized, but actually, if you look at the whole picture, those permanent pastures are actually sequestering an awful lot of carbon. Finally, in terms of land use, we've got to water. I'm not going to say very much about this. This is cow green. Obviously, supply is important. This is something that Teesdale provides, the land in Teesdale provides. Quality, that's impacted by the peat a bit as well, which we touched on. And leisure and tourism, just to say, there are water-related activities. Fishing, actually, the wild trout is some of the best in the country, funnily enough. And on the tourism side, there's also canoeing, and we're trying to manage that a bit better. It can be a bit of a free-for-all and can be problematic, in fact, for as much for the damage it does to the banks as anything else. So just overall, in conclusion, in terms of present and what's happening, we're trying to do a bit more with tourism. We're doing up cottages and farms in a way that perhaps we didn't used to, especially derelict ones. We're looking at carbon carefully, and generally just looking at various options, but we're very aware that it's a multi-use landscape. And I strongly feel, and I mentioned this earlier, that farming and nature can work together. And it seems to me, you know, there's often a lot of moans on all sides, but if everyone's moaning, it usually means that everyone's compromising a bit and it's probably working in a way. I think when you hear so much about, when we're talking about nature and rewilding, the human presence doesn't seem to get a look in at all. And I really feel that's wrong. We're also part of nature, and that must be the case in Upper Teesdale. So in a way, I feel Upper Teesdale is a really good example to take elsewhere of how high nature value farming and farming can work with nature. Just briefly and finally, really looking at sort of threats and opportunities. I have to say, I think there are more threats, unfortunately, at the moment than opportunities, but there are some opportunities as well. Climate change, obviously, that's in the background. It's happening. We all know that's happening. It will sort of affect everything. Exactly how, it's difficult to tell. Just some old pictures of what the Dale used to be like. There's no doubt about it. The climate is changing, even though we can still get fairly great extremes up there. I slightly wonder what the men were doing when that photo was taken on the left. So as much as anything, I think it's about extremes of weather. Just a picture of high force with lots of water. And another taken a couple of years ago, I think it was when, after that first lockdown, when there was that very dry period, and actually Upper Teesdale became quite parched. One of the areas that is a concern, I would argue, is the sort of synchronization of plants and insects and birds and so on. And this is one of the things that actually happened with the grouse. They do like the young grouse, whether it be red grouse, black grouse, do like the protein of insects. And with changing climate, you can find the hatching doesn't necessarily coincide with the hatching of the insects. And so there's things like that to think about. This, believe it or not, is an opportunity. What I'm really showing here is the fact that now with new technology and so on, and Wi-Fi, the internet, relatively remote areas, it's practical to live and work in these areas in a way that it possibly wasn't in the past. And that this, I think, will lead to a revival of, you know, cottages and housing. So I mentioned the building costs are often the same wherever it is in the country, but rents are low. But I feel that there's opportunities now in this respect, and these are some of the Raby properties that have had some work done on them or indeed been sold. And I don't have a policy. I feel that some of the properties on the margins, there's nothing wrong with selling those at all. In fact, it's good for the Dale. So this is Unthank again, which had been derelict for some years, and it's now being done up and is almost completed. The other difference, I think, if properties were sold or in the past, and it's happened a lot in the Lake District and indeed in a lot of the North Yorkshire Dales, they've been bought as holiday lets, and that's not to say they're, or second homes, and that's not to say they don't then rent them out. Holiday lets and people, but it doesn't mean that the same people are there much all the time, and that can lead to a loss of community. But I think now with the internet and different working practices, people are happy to be somewhere, indeed want to be somewhere more remote. Another big change coming along the tracks is farming transition. I know Richard Betton is going to speak on this, so I'm not going to say much at all. Just simply mention that it's a time of huge change. I think being part of the EU, in the past there was a kind of support that had been there for a very long time in various guises, whether it's ESAs or ELSAs and so on. Of course, that has now changed. This country is now in theory in charge of its own destiny, and various policies are taking place, and there's quite a complicated set of grants, opportunities in front of farmers, but at the same time, the main BPS, which was the main support, is going. And in fact, what is coming in, there is absolutely no support for actually farming or producing food. The support is for generally environmental measures. But as I say, Richard will, I'm sure, be going into detail of that when he talks. Now, I'm moving on to free trade agreements. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, this. I personally see this as a huge threat. And it's not surprising, really, that we now have the opportunity of doing our own agreements, and that the government wants to get agreements with these countries, not just about agriculture. In fact, probably the agriculture is a bit of a sideshow to the whole thing. It's to get all the other sectors. But in a way, the agriculture is having to take up the slack. So what's happened? The UK has already agreed a free trade agreement with Australia. It's agreed in principle with New Zealand. Other countries are queuing up. I believe Canada is the next in line, but there's a whole load of others. The UK has sort of made it clear that it's been looking for a FTA with the USA. I think Biden hasn't been keen because of, I believe, because of the politics related to Northern Ireland and so forth. But there's talk now of doing deals with individual US states. I have to say, whilst the direction of travel of free trade is something we can't automatically denigrate, protectionism, is possibly a dirty word in some areas, but nonetheless, with the best will in the world, we will struggle to keep with countries that have different standards and have a different scale. And farming is still actually the backbone of rural life. So just a few elements of the UK Australian FTA, some statistics I bringing up. So what's been sort of given away is basically unfettered market access for agricultural products with no tariffs whatsoever and no quotas at all after 15 years. There are quotas now which are being gradually reduced. They're quite generous quotas, actually, far, far bigger than what there has been before. At the moment, Australia isn't using up its quotas, but that's partially because of the Asian markets, and that's where their focus is. But with all this political uncertainty and so on, it wouldn't take much to suddenly for them to switch. And I think we've got to be prepared for things like that. There were some environmental provisions that the UK were trying to put in relating to the climate change agreements and so on, but these have been dropped for the agreement on Australia's insistence. Australian beef industry is a massive, massive industry and a big, big export industry. And the cost of production for Australian beef farmers are around 2.5 times less than for UK farmers. The sheep sector is about 65% lower. It's about the same for New Zealand as well. And they're both massive exporters, particularly New Zealand with sheep, which are mainly going to the Asian market at the moment. In terms of scale, which gives them the economies of scale, it's just a comparison, 65% of Australian farms have between 100 and 400 head of cattle. The farms with over 5,400 head of cattle account for about 30% of the country's beef. This is in comparison with the average UK herd of 27. This is an example of some sort of feeding setup. This one is in Australia, but there's lots everywhere. They call themselves CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. So it's all grain-based, it's all brought in. This one is 26,500 cattle. It's owned by a massive Brazilian corporation, $52 billion a year turnover. They've got 140 processing plants. Issues with this, obviously, antibiotic use because the cattle are in close proximity, and also sort of waste, really, manure, eutrophication of water supplies, stuff like that. They're all grain fed, I think I mentioned that. Something on standards, we've been told that standards won't be dropped. And I think that is true certainly with the hormone fed beef. On the main things, that's true. In Australia, it is legal to do hormone fed, it's illegal in this country. Having said that, Australia, I don't want to knock Australia, so it's just because they're the first ones that have got these trade agreements, so that's why I'm concentrating on them. But the hormone fed beef, there's plenty of non-hormone fed beef in Australia, and very good quality beef as well, and I'm sure that will be checked and that will be the only ones coming over. But there are other stuff which I'm not so sure will be stopped, because there's no way, for example, the transport times are suddenly going to be changed, or the things like that, or indeed the branding, or the mulesing. So the standards are actually different, and the welfare standards are much higher in this country. And I would argue, actually, Australia and New Zealand have pretty high welfare standards compared to some other countries. So, so that, you know, we are very, very much top of the class in that one. So I think it's very, very worrying indeed, not immediately in the short term because of these quotas and people are thinking of other things, but in the long term. The trouble is, if you're investing in agriculture, 15 years, which is the length of time that all the quotas will go, isn't actually a particularly long time. I think it's quite bad about carbon footprint. The other thing, there's no thought of food security, which has come into light recently. We're talking about energy security at the moment because of Ukraine. Well, what about food security? There are some standards relating to the strength of some safeguards, but they're very vague and there's no detail at present as far as I'm aware. And if, for example, if there was a huge amount of importing, could the UK do anything about it as things stand? And I don't know the answer to that, actually, at the moment. So I'm not arguing against free trade, it's just that it seems to be, you know, all controls seem to be taken and all market access seems to have been given. I think there are more checks and balances required. And if we are going to get more competitive, then, you know, let's have a sort of game plan of how that is going to be done. So that's a rather negative ending, but it is a great concern. So back to who determines the view. Well, I think at the moment, national government is determining the view more than any other party, quite frankly. There'll always be change, but what we want is well thought out, managed change. Where the future path will lead, who knows? But, you know, I think there are some very positive things as well as less positive ones, and there's plenty to play for still. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
How do I'm just quite sure how I get rid of the picture. How can
if you click on share screen, I think it should take you off share screen. Along the top somewhere, if you wander around. It should say share content. You'll have a button that you can click and it'll take you off it.
I can do stop share.
That's it. That's it. And now we've got you back again.
Okay.
And then we can go to switch to multi-view. And I'll leave you over to Margaret. What we normally do now.
You could now see some of the audience that you've been talking to. Thank you very much for a very interesting account, and also, well, I go right back to some of your earliest records, and I'd be personally very interested to know more about that diary that you read. The other thing is that I came into the Dale, 70 years ago, and I came from East Yorkshire, where the farms, ours was a rather small one of 200 acres, and they went up to 1,000 acres of mixed arable farming. And so I was very, very surprised and almost appalled of the smallness of the farms up in the Dale. They seem to me to be about 20 acres and 10 cows and maybe hill grazing, of course. And what I didn't appreciate at the very beginning was that a lot of the farmers did have second jobs in the quarries, on the roads, etc. Sorry. I think the other thing I'd like to mention is that I think it's very good for you to have put Teesdale in perspective with the free trade of the world. We may not like it, but it was necessary to have it brought to our attention. However, as chairman, I've had enough to say. I wonder if anyone else has any questions. Trish,
I'm here.
Will you please field the questions, because you hear better than me?
I'll do my best. What we normally do is either people wave their hand so that we can see it, or you put a wavy hand up in the chat, or if people would like to put something in the chat, if they have the dexterity to be able to tap into the chat. Does anybody have? And then if you can unmute, ask your question and then go on. Right, Fal's got a hand up first. Fal, if you'd like to ask your question.
Right, thank you. Thank you for your informative talk. That's the first. As a botanist, I was most concerned about with the survival of the flora and fauna in Upper Teesdale. Yes, I have met Andy Gibson, but I would like to know your view a bit more, how to protect the nature's stronghold, as you said, from the influx of leisure-seeking visitors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think there's got to be a balance as far as the leisure-seeking visitors are concerned. But before talking about that, I think agricultural transition will be more nature friendly anyway. So from that point of view, the detail is not totally clear yet, but the payments will be based up to a point on improvements in natural capital. So in that respect, I think from nature's point of view, that is a positive, as long as it can be done in such a way that it doesn't impact too much on the farm. On the leisure side, which is the one you specifically raise, I think what we have to do, I mean, there are going to be those honeypots anyway, low force, high force. Even if we never publicized high force, you're going to get huge numbers of visitors. I mean, it's just well known, and with social media and so on, information just goes around so quickly, and people come to hear of things. I think it has to be managed. I would like to see in terms of footpaths, perhaps the obvious circular paths and things being well signed and everything, so people don't get lost, which can cause a problem. A lot of walkers want to stick to the footpaths but don't. But then there are other footpaths that frankly lead from nowhere to nowhere. But I think if the ones that might be popular are the ones that are well signed, people tend to stick to those. it's, you know, in terms of what Raby are thinking of doing in the Upperdale, we're probably thinking of doing a bit more at high force, but in the scheme of things, it's relatively modest, I would say. To, you know, we're not talking huge caravan parks or anything like that. There will be a bit of a balance between wildlife and tourism, simply because where you get too much, it can cause disturbance. There's no doubt about that. I think it just has to be managed. I don't know if that's answered your question.
Val?
The managed, yes. Can you explain a little bit more about that managed, I quote, unquote? Thank you.
Well,
Any
I would
more
argue that
questions?
the main Raby attraction, High Force, is already managed.
Uh-huh.
The management also extends, you know, the ANOB and other organisations are obviously involved in this same area in that extent. In terms of exact management, I can't, I mean, actually say we can manage around High Force. We can look into doing stuff with footpaths and so on, but, you know, the public have a perfectly statutory right to walk on all these public footpaths. You could improve signage. I think the keepers actually do a reasonable job where, you know, you have dogs off a lead when they shouldn't be in the breeding season, things like that. You know, that's people do have a right to, quite rightly, to walk on public footpaths. And if that's what you're talking about, or perhaps you're talking about areas, and there is also the right to roam as well, on the non you know, higher up on the moorland. So we can do what we can do, but we can't do it all alone.
It's the low force area and the barbecue in the low force area and people jumping from the bridge in the winch bridge. So it's really, you could see visually, and with the plants population, when you measure it for last 10-15 years, you can see that destruction and the decline of the plant. So that was my question. What is your protection or help for the low force area and the winch bridge?
Yeah.
And the fire will be the most damaging things in there.
Yeah. Okay, in that area, I think the land agent, Joe Romson, would be in a better position to answer the exact details of that. But I know that we are in talks with a lot of the canoeists about access and making sure that they have the right permits and are responsible. Can you hear me still?
Yeah, we can. For some
something
reason or other,
happened.
Tom Falk's sharing his screen.
Oh, right.
I'll turn off screen sharing. Sorry about that.
So
right, that puts us back to where we were. Sorry about that.
So as far as the canoeists are concerned, we are doing stuff and are actively trying to manage that. I think more generally, there is a sort of forum, and certainly there was a forum during the COVID times between various bodies, including the police, to discuss measures and how this could be managed. And I suspect those are still something that will continue. I don't think there's been quite the same level of sort of antisocial behaviour that there has been, there was immediately after lockdown when all the pubs were closed and there weren't any police around. But yes, it is an issue.
If I'd be able to speak a bit more about what happens on the ground, and more specific measures, if that's what you're interested in.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
So last summer, essentially, when I started in June, I sort of saw what worked is having the truck essentially parked right down there provides a presence, lets the public who are visiting know that there's someone there, educating people on their way in, checking essentially that people don't have barbecues, know that they're not allowed to have fires, and the reason why they're not allowed to have fires. Having that communication, as Lord Barnard says, with the police, with the AOMB, with the other, not with Natural England, with the people in the area that know that on the problem days that we may need help with these situations down there, as it is quite difficult for one person to do by themselves, I've found, but essentially taking a zero tolerance policy, as you say, against fire, because it probably is the most damaging thing down there. But I think the main visitor interaction we want to have is education rather than sort of berating and telling people off. We want to educate people as to what the special wildflowers are down there, why we have the policies on fire, why we have this, because a lot of people are visiting there and don't always understand the area and just come in for the day and maybe aren't familiar with it. As you say, with I-Force, we have a bit of a bottleneck out there down to Riverside on the Triple SI, where we can essentially educate people on the way in, inform them of the rules, inform them about the area, and I think it works at low force best at the entrance where you come through the fields there, coming down into the woodland to low force. You sort of have a bottleneck there as well, where we can sort of implement the same strategy again, and that's what I plan to do this summer as well. Just have a presence down there and educate visitors.
Thank you, Andy. Martin's got a question.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment, and I was trying to get in, so thanks, Tricia, because it relates directly to those last two contributions. I think Andy's appointment and the work he's doing is terrific, and I think it is the way forward. But the point that Val raises is widely shared, or the view that what underlies it is, I think if you just take a step back to the sort of immediate post-COVID, lifting of the lockdown, and I was one of 4 people who went down to low force on the very first day of that, and we spent we spent a long time picking up a vast quantity of rubbish, including huge quantities of nitrous oxide cylinders and goodness knows what. And I think people weren't prepared for it. But I think there are kind of 2 choices. It seems to me logically moving forward, and I'll be quite brief. Probably those numbers peaked then and have, I mean, it's been much, much busier ever since then. But I think that is likely to decline, it seems obvious, as tourism is opening up elsewhere, and in particular, as it's opening up abroad. I mean, people who were coming here used to go to somewhere else before they came here. But now that people know about here, and the point that Lord Barnard made about social media is with us, and that's how they know about here. It's also part of the solution, and it is about education, as Andy says. I don't think people come here malevolently, wanting to damage what's here and be vindictively unpleasant. And I mean, a few do, but very few, in my experience. It's about education, and I think we need to work hard and fast. And this goes directly back to Margaret's group, the trust, the general movement to protect the flora in Teesdale and other aspects of local wildlife. We either educate people, harness them and encourage them to be more aware of what is so special about the area and come here supportively. You'll also encourage more people. I mean, nature tourism is a huge thing in itself. And just 1 or 2 very quick comments. For example, as you come into Teesdale over Whistle crag where so many people stopped to take that iconic photograph, perhaps it would be possible to have a notice that was slightly more welcoming than take your litter home, maximum penalty £150. You could say something like, welcome to Teesdale, one of the country's most exceptional sites for nature. Please, we hope you enjoy it and please respect it. You know, that's the sort of bottom line, rather crude thing, and I'll stop at that. But I think there's a lot to be built on, and actually there's some considerable urgency about doing it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Derek.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk, and it's very refreshing to see somebody with really good enthusiasm for the Dale. I'm sure you have a very difficult job trying to keep lots of balls in the air at the same time and taking an interest in lots of different sections of what happens in the Dale. Obviously, my interest, great interest, is in the flora, flowers and in the Dale as well. But we also see the tourism while we're doing that. Obviously, the jewel in the crown is high force, and I would like to congratulate you on the way that you altered the path. That was a very nice little thing you've done, which makes it a nicer little walk round the to see high force and takes away a lot of the people. Whether you had to do that for COVID or not, I don't know, but it's worked to me, I think it's worked very well. High force to me seems a prime site for more development for the tourism. I'm sure a beautiful restaurant in the car park doing lunches and teas would go like a bomb, but whether that would be overstepping the mark and bringing too many people in, I don't know. But the education, I think, is the key to an awful lot, and good signage that's been already said. It would be nice to educate people about the beauties and about the rarities in Teesdale, like the flowers, etc., etc. But how you do that and how you let them see them without damage coming to it, I don't know the answer to that question. But what is your thoughts on further development at high force around the hotel area and the parking? Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, we are thinking of there's the buildings at the back of High Force Hotel, and we're thinking of doing something with that, and possibly something in the car park, sort of a grab and go type thing. I think the reality is we are thinking of a bit around that, but nothing has been agreed actually. The reality is people come there, whatever. I mean, we obviously advertise it, but actually it's massively popular, and I think even without any advertising, with social media and all the rest, it's going to be visited a lot, and I personally think that's a good thing anyway. There is perhaps a demand for doing some of the facilities a bit better. You've got a thing where all the, at the moment there is a sort of kiosk, but generally people might go into the hotel, but there's only so many that can go in there. If you've also got to look after residents or people who are sort of perhaps wanting a slightly different experience from those who just want to grab a burger or something like that. It's a good point about the path. That actually sort of COVID really fell in our favor on that one, because we did do it for that reason and the social distancing, because the path's quite narrow, so it needed to be a one-way path. But actually it is, I think, a good thing in the long run anyway. So that's really been to our advantage. I think you've raised a good point about education, and perhaps we should give a bit of thought to how we could better educate people, possibly who arrive at the car park, something like that, on aspects of high force, but also sort of responsible behaviour and things like that. That also extends, I was just thinking the context of low force, because of course there's the Methodist Chapel, the AMAB, which provides quite a lot of information. But of course, a lot of people will park on the road and go straight in and won't necessarily go there. Whereas at least at high force with a car park, at least there are people there, manning staff who you can ask questions to or could provide information.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, I do believe that the more people know about plants, the more they will care about them, as far as and the things that are valuable to the Upper Teesdale. The more people realise the value of them, the more they will care for them. But thank you for that.
Is anybody else waving their hand? Have I missed anybody? Judith Coleman. Yeah, Judith. Judith, you need to unmute.
Oh. Yes, I'd be interested to hear about a bit about the farms. I'm fairly new to the area, and I just wonder how many farms there are, tenant farms on the estate, and does the size of them vary? We've heard that they're small compared to Margaret's experience in East Yorkshire. Does the size of the farms on the estate vary much? And you seem to indicate that younger people are there seems to be a pool of younger people that are keen to come to farm these areas, and I'm just wondering if you could, is that the case? Is that what's happening as you re-let farms?
Yes, well, in terms of numbers, Upper Teesdale, I mean, it slightly depends what you call a small holding, what you call a farm, between 60 and 70, that sort of number. They are on the whole, they do vary in size. There are some bigger ones where you've got the full, I mean, also it depends obviously on the quality of the land. The larger farms, I would say somewhere like Balance Lodge would come into that category. You've got a full-time farmer, others where there are part-time. In fact, one or two I can think of where both members of the family are actually working full-time elsewhere, but that's quite unusual. So they do vary, and the other thing to think about is that the land varies so enormously. I mean, there's a massive difference between sort of Middleton and Teesdale and sort of High Force, and then what happens above High Force, going basically Forest and Teesdale, going to say as far as Langdon Beck, and then what happens in Harwood. So the quality of land varies absolutely enormously. And also individual farms will have certain stintage and rights on the fells for X number of sheep for grazing. So obviously that makes that increases the capacity of that farm. In terms of lettings and things, I think people recognise that well, you'd be paying a rent wherever you live anyway, so there's that element, if you like. There's the house element, and I think there's a lot of people who just really love the idea of getting into farming. It's in their blood, really. And they recognize that they'll have to do other stuff as well. But it is a very uncertain time. You know, there have been quite a bit of support in the past through environmental payments and things. And although some payments will go forward, it's all changed at the moment, and we don't know exactly what is what on that front.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned people, farms where both adults, as it were, are working elsewhere. And you also talked about renovating properties because people can come and work at whatever they do remotely. I'm just interested to know what happens to the land if people are renting the properties and not farming the land.
Yes, well, I was thinking primarily of properties that have become derelict. So the land has already been amalgamated into other holdings. I mean, they may have been derelict for years or even decades. So, and alternatively, they may be cottages as well. In terms of farms, on the whole, we're not sort of amalgamating, although there may be some exceptions to that. But you're right; they are very small holdings compared to most parts of the country. But having said that, you look at somewhere like Harwood, and I don't have that exact statistic on me. I know Richard Betton does, but there are only, I think there are 8 farms up there now, and there used to be it was something like 30 or 40 at one point. So although the holdings are very small now, they used to be a lot smaller. And the part-time approach seems to actually work. Often those who are taking farms will have family in other farms, and they might kind of work the two together, things like that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
There was a question in the chat about where am I? I'll go and find it. There was a question in the chat about the consideration of the forestry in the woodland in Upper Teesdale, expanding the area's woodland on appropriate, carefully selected marginal land, planting the right kind of trees in the right types of places. Because I don't think you've touched on your woodlands and trees, have you?
No, actually, I've just reminded myself that I had got that in my notes and I forgot to mention it. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, I was thinking of actually the different land use and how that whole question, which really comes back to the original question of determining the view and habitats. There's a lot of talk about commercial forestry on a large scale for carbon. There's also a lot of talk on rewilding. But generally, I feel that the balance, none of them are very convincing. The commercial forestry, for a start, I mean, you certainly wouldn't be able to do that on peatland, even if you wanted to. And fundamentally a monocrop on that scale in Upper Teesdale, I would argue, would be very inappropriate on a sort of moor or farm scale. But I think there's plenty of scope for smaller sort of native planting in the sort of gills and places where trees will establish quite well. I mean, I'm interested, going back to the rewilding thing, on how a tree would do actually on a sort of on the top, so to speak. And I really don't think they would do terribly well now. And I believe up at Moorhouse at the nature reserve there's been no sort of grazing or anything for decades, but I don't think any trees have really established there. I think the heather has got woodier. You only have to look at the wind and so on in the last few days to recognize that they'd still need a fairly sheltered environment to really get going. But it would be great to see some more native sensitive planting in appropriate areas. I hope that answers the question.
I think that's possibly something that Teesdale are also going to be tackling in their remit, aren't they? And I know Margaret's got some ideas as well.
Yeah, and Margaret's definitely fed in some ideas, which are great, and Teesdale are looking at possible sites as well. Yes.
Right. Are there any more questions?
Oh, sorry, Martin's got his hand up.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. My question is not so much botanical, it's really more observational. I've lived in Darlington for about 30 years, and driving up to Upper Teesdale, the characteristic feature of the land is the white cottages. And I've always wanted to know, is there any particular anecdote related to the color white for cottages, or is it just a practical thing really?
Well, it's a good question. The problem is there are a number of anecdotes, so it's difficult to know which one to believe. There's quite a few that are related to hunting, and the lord at the time got lost hunting and went to some farmhouse, and it was quite run down. He was rather bald, and made sure, anyway, had very good hospitality, but made sure, he said, oh, something will be done about it, and made sure that work was to go ahead there, only to find he didn't actually own it, which was one thing. But there are various variations on that theme, really. I don't know. Funnily enough, a lot of historically quite a lot more traditional farmhouses were sort of lime washed than they are now. I mean, not just on the estate, but generally. And I'm wondering if partially is that just Raby kept to that tradition, whereas the others moved on from that. But there are probably better anecdotes than the one I just said, actually. But they're all along the lines of getting lost hunting and making a fool of himself in the fog.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Martin. I think that was a good question to draw the meeting to a close. This has been fascinating, and I'm delighted there have been so many people who've had questions to ask, and that you've been here, made yourself available to answer the questions. And sorry, so I always put this down to, I'm glad to see, an aging factor, I call it. I get little breaks in my mental flow. Yes, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed, Barnard. You've really done us proud, because I think you had doubts about being able to fill the time. And you probably noticed that you've had 2 hours almost. And I hope you got something to eat before you started and aren't waiting for your supper now. Thank you very much.